of 2 ramp guards and marking 4 vans which were empty and looked ready to go. The driver of the furthest of the 4 empties stood in the back of his vehicle, a few feet above the platform. When Trigger came level with him, he was studying her. He was a big young man with tousled black hair and a rough and ready look. He was grinning very faintly. He knew the ways of Colonial School students. Trigger raised her left hand a few inches, 3 fingers up. His grin widened. He shook his head and raised both hands in a corresponding gesture, 8 fingers. Trigger frowned at him, stopped, and looked back along the row of vans. Then left hand up again, 4 fingers and thumb. The driver made a circle with finger and thumb, a deal for 5 Macedon crowns, which was about standard fare for unauthorized passage out of the school. Trigger wandered on to the end of the platform, turned and came back, still unhurriedly, but now close to the edge of the ramp. Down the line, another van slammed open and back, and a stream of crates swooped out, riding a gravity beam from the roof toward a waiting storeroom carrier. The guard closest to Trigger turned to watch the process. Trigger took 6 quick steps and reached her driver. He put down a hand to help her step up. She slipped the 5-crown piece into his palm. "Up front," he whispered hoarsely. "Next to the driver's seat and keep down. How far?" "Nearest tube line." He grinned again and nodded. "Can do." 20 minutes later, Trigger was in a downtown ComWeb booth. There had been a minor modification in her plans, and she'd stopped off in a store a few doors away and picked up a carefully nondescript street dress and a scarf. She changed into the dress now and bundled the school costume into a deposit box, which she dispatched to Central Deposit with a 1-crown piece, getting a numbered slip in return. It had occurred to her that there was a chance otherwise of getting caught in a Colonial School roundup if it was brought to Dr. Plemponi's attention that there appeared to be considerably more students out in the town at the moment than could be properly overlooked. Or even, Trigger thought, if somebody simply happened to have missed Trigger Argee. She slipped the rainrobe over her shoulders, dropped a coin into the ComWeb, and covered the silver blonde hair with a scarf. The screen lit up. She asked for General Commerce transportation. Waiting, she realized suddenly that so far she was rather enjoying herself. There had been a little argument with the van driver who, it turned out, had ideas of his own about modifying Trigger's plans. A complication she'd run into frequently in her school days, too. As usual, it didn't develop into a very serious argument. Truckers who dealt with the Colonial School knew, or learned in 1 or 2 briefly horrid lessons, that Mihol's commando-trained charges were prone to ungirlish methods of discouragement when argued with too urgently. The view screen switched on. The transportation clerk's glance flickered over Trigger's street dress when she told him her destination. His expression remained bland. Yes, the Dawn City was leaving Spaceport for the Manon system tomorrow evening. Yes, it was Subspace Express, one of the newest and fastest, in fact. His eyes slipped over the dress again. Also one of the most luxurious, he might add. There would be only 2 3-hour stops in the hub beyond Macedon. 1 each off Evely and Garth. Then a straight dive to Manon, unless, of course, gravitic storm shifts forced the ship to surface temporarily. Average time for the Dawn City on the run was 11 days. The slowest trip so far had required 16. "But unfortunately, madam, there are only a very few cabins left. And not very desirable ones, I'm afraid." He looked apologetic. "There hasn't been a vacancy on the Manon run for the past 3 months." "I can stand it, I imagine," Trigger said. "How much for the cheapest?" The clerk cleared his throat gently and told her. She couldn't help blinking, though she was braced for it. But it was more than she had counted on. A great deal more. It would leave her, in fact, with exactly 126 crowns out of her entire savings, plus the coin she had in her purse. "Any extras?" she asked, a little hoarsely. He shrugged. "There's Traveler's Rest," he said negligently. 900 for the 3 dive periods. But rest is optional, of course. Some passengers prefer the experience of staying awake during a subspace dive. He smiled, rather sadistically, Trigger felt, and added, "Till they've lived through one of them, that is." Trigger nodded. She'd lived through quite a few of them. She didn't like subspace particularly, nobody did. But except for an occasional touch of nausea or dizziness at the beginning of a dive, it didn't bother her much. Many people got hallucinations, went into states of panic, or just got very sick. "Anything else?" she asked. Just the usual tips and things, said the clerk. He looked surprised. Does Madam wish to make the reservation? Madam does, Trigger told him coldly. How long will it hold? It would be good for up to an hour before takeoff, she learned. If not claimed then, it would be filled from the last-minute waiting list. She left the booth thoughtfully. At least the Dawn City would be leaving in less than 26 hours. She wouldn't have to spend much of her remaining capital before she got off Macedon. She'd skip meals, she decided, except breakfast next morning, which would be covered by her hotel room fee. And it wasn't going to be any middle-class hotel. There was no one obviously waiting for her at the Bank of Macedon. In fact, since that venerable institution covered a city block with entrances running up from the street level to the 58th floor, a small army would have been needed to make sure of spotting her. She had to identify herself to get into the vaults, but there was a solution to that. 7 years ago, when Runzer Argee died suddenly and she had to get his property and records straightened out, a gray-haired little vault attendant with whom she dealt with had taken a fatherly interest in her. When she saw he was still on the job, Trigger was certain the matter would go off all right. It did. He didn't take a really close look at her until she shoved her signature and the Federation identification in front of him. Then his head bobbed up briskly. His eyes lit up. "Trigger!" He bounced out of his chair. His right hand shot out. "Good to see you again. I've been hearing about you." They shook hands. She put a finger to her lips. "I'm here incog," she cautioned in a low voice. "Can you handle this quietly?" The faded blue eyes widened slightly, but he asked no questions. Trigger Argee's name was known rather widely, as a matter of fact, particularly on her homeworld, and as he remembered Trigger, she wasn't a girl who would go look for a spotlight to stand in. He nodded. "Sure can." He glanced suspiciously at the nearest customers, then looked down at what Trigger had written. He frowned. "You're drawing out everything? Not leaving Ceyce for good, are you?" "No," Trigger said. "I'll be back. This is just a temporary emergency." That was all the explaining she had to do. 4 minutes later, she had her money. 3 minutes after that, she had paid for the Dawn City reservation as Birna Drelganoth and deposited her thumbprints with the ticket office. Counting what was left, she found it came to just under 138. Definitely no dinner tonight. She needed a suitcase and a change of clothing, and then she'd just better go sit in that hotel room. The street level traffic was moderate around the bank, but it began to thicken as she approached a shopping center 2 blocks further on. Striding along, neither hurrying nor idling, Trigger decided she had it made. The only real chance to catch up with her had been at the bank, and the old vault attendant wouldn't talk. Half a block from the shopping center, a row of spacers on planet leave came rollicking cheerily toward her, uniform jackets unbuttoned, 3 Ceyce girls in arm-linked formation among them, all happily high. Trigger shifted toward the edge of the sidewalk to let them pass. As the line swayed up on her left, there was a shadowy settling of an aircar at the curb to her right. With loud outcries of glad recognition and whoops of laughter, the line swung in about her, close. Bodies crowded against her. A hand was clapped over her mouth. Other hands held her arms. Her feet came off the ground and she had a momentary awareness of being rushed expertly forward. Then she was in the car, half on her side over the rear seat. 2 very strong hands clamping her wrists together behind her back. As she sucked in her breath for a yell, the door snapped shut behind her, cutting off the rollicking ha-ha-ha's and other noises outside. There was a lurching twist as the air car shot upward. End of chapter 4.